Great. Okay. Well, thanks for coming along. As introduced, I'm Colin Eberhardt. I'm the CTO of SOOCon23, and I'm going to be asking a question today, which is, could the public sector solve the open source sustainability challenges? And this is basically a talk of two halves. The first is a little bit of research that I undertook myself a couple of years ago around open source sustainability and some of the challenges I uncovered. And the second is a research project that I undertook last year, which I feel gives a glimpse of some of the potential solutions. But first, a little bit about me. And you'll probably notice that isn't me, that's my dog. He's much better looking, so I thought I'd put him on the slide. I was also hoping to get a beautiful hand-drawn sketch of my dog, so if I just leave it on there for a little while, fantastic. I'll just keep it there. He's called Alfie, yeah? Okay. I've been building open source for about the past 25 years. I'm one of these people where if you look at my GitHub profile, it does look like a tiled bathroom. Open source is something that's really an interesting intersection for me. It's part of my personal life. I code in my spare time, but also it's part of my professional life. As the CTO of a growing consultancy, I'm very much looking at how the work we can do can have a positive impact on the open source world. But diving into the sort of the main body of the talk. So a few years ago, I started to get concerned about some of the security issues that were occurring within the open source world, and it very much felt like these were on the rise. You'll have no doubt heard of Log4j, but years ago, before that actually made the news, there were a number of sort of smaller incidents that were starting to become more frequent. And this got me thinking, how much do I actually know about the code that I personally rely upon? And I thought, as a responsible developer, I should probably find out a little bit more. So what I did was I picked a project pretty much at random and decided I was going to perform a bit of a deep dive analysis to find out what is this code, where does it come from, and to be honest, can I trust it? So the project I picked is Express.js. Some of you may have heard about this. Express is pretty much the de facto web server for Node. So if you're running Node or running JavaScript, you'll almost certainly be using this in some fashion. Now, Node's got almost 60,000 stars on GitHub. It's in the top 100 of projects on GitHub. It's a tremendously popular open source project. So I thought this is a good subject for my analysis. It's also supported by OpenJS, which are part of Linux Foundation. So it's a tremendously mature project. And my first experience was, yeah, I loved it. It works really well, quality software, and at a great price. Free, you know. What is there not to love? But then what I did was I started to delve, open up the covers and start looking under the hood and look at how is Express actually built. So I started downloading the project metadata and looking at how the project evolved over time. Now, the first thing to point out is Express isn't one project. Express is actually 49 projects. And over time, the complexity has increased. So you can see the number of dependencies on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And typically what happens is the number of dependencies grow over time, and then at major version releases, there's often a period of consolidation, reducing dependencies, then it grows once again. This is pretty typical these days. Virtually every piece of software that you will be using will be composed of a fairly significant number of other software projects. That's just the way it is these days. I'm kind of okay with that, but I'm starting to feel a little bit uneasy because initially I thought, right, I want to learn about Express, find out how secure that is, and do I trust it? I don't have one problem now, I've got 49 problems. I've now got 49 projects that I really should start paying a bit more attention to. Unfortunately, that's actually the tip of a much larger iceberg. With Express, it has 195 development dependencies. So what this means is the supply chain used to actually compile and run Express is even bigger. Now, should I care about this? Well, yes, you should. You'll have almost certainly heard of software supply chain attacks. It was something that people weren't really talking about 4 or 5 years ago, but now it's much more well known. So a software supply chain attack is where I attack one of these dependencies that's part of the process of building Express, and I use that as a way to inject my malicious code. People have used this to do things like Bitcoin mining or stealing keys for Bitcoin wallets or all kinds of other sort of interesting attacks. Interestingly, Eric talked about having a list of critical software, Eric from Google, and how Log4j wasn't ever on what they considered to be the list of critical software. I think the whole principle of creating a critical software list is actually fundamentally flawed. Any software that you use in production is critical, it's an attack vector, and any software that is part of your supply chain is critical, it's an attack vector. So I don't believe you can condense it down to 100 or a couple of hundred projects. They're all critical, they're all susceptible to attack. So yeah, this complexity is starting to make me a little bit nervous now. You know, the further I go down the rabbit hole, the more concerned I get. The next question I asked is, if I install Express, or you install Express, do you get exactly the same thing? That's not always the case. The way that this complex graph of dependencies is built up is by a clever concept called semantic versioning. It's a way of saying, I depend on version 1.5, but sure, 1.6, that's fine, I'll take that. And once you've got a complex dependency graph of 195 dependencies, it gets even more complicated. So between Express 4.16.4 and 4.17, there are actually 33 different variants of Express due to this dependency tree. Yeah, I'm getting pretty scared now. This is getting really, really quite complicated. So probably the most critical question that I asked myself next was, who holds the keys? Who determines when one of these pieces of software gets released to NPM, which is a standard distribution mechanism? So I took a look at it. Of the 49 dependencies, there were 88 maintainers. So what this means is there are 88 individuals who are actively able to deploy code which becomes part of Express. So there are 88 people who are involved in the distribution process. Unfortunately, only 9% of developers have two-factor authentication enabled on NPM. That was a statistic published in 2020. As a result of this, I now have the email addresses of all 88 maintainers. I took the very first one and I typed it into a website that you can use to determine whether an email address has been disclosed as part of an attack. And the very first one had. The very first one, I had one of their passwords. Now, considering a lot of people recycle passwords, I'm willing to bet that if I spent half an hour, I could get into one of these accounts. Now, trust me, I didn't do that, honest, but it's fairly obvious that there's a certain amount of fragility here. So yeah, I'm getting really scared about this now. And in all honesty, Express was the first project that I picked quite by random. I wasn't expecting to uncover something which made me feel so concerned and uncomfortable. So the final question I ask myself is, who is carrying the ultimate burden here? Who is making sure that I'm safe? Who is worrying about all of this complexity on my behalf? Who is at the top of the pile in Express? Who is the maintainer of Express? Or what is the community around Express? Unfortunately, there isn't really a community. There's one individual. There's one maintainer who carries the burden for the majority of the work that is undertaken within Express, which is actually not terribly unusual these days with open source software. Quite often, there will be one core maintainer or maybe one or two core maintainers for the software that you rely upon. And finding out more about this individual, it didn't take me too long to find out that this particular individual wasn't terribly happy. It was only a year before I started doing this analysis that I discovered that there had been a vulnerability disclosed relating to Express. A lot of security vendors had messaged all of their clients about a particular CVE, so all of a sudden, of the 29 million downloads, there were probably 29 million people all of a sudden going, oh, we've got a security vulnerability. Doug, that's the name of the maintainer, can you sort it out for us? Funnily enough, this didn't go down terribly well, especially as someone tried to propose a fix, which Doug effectively said, that's not the right way to do it. Under the increasing pressure of his clients, in air quotes, he said, I'm giving up on this. I'm walking away from my computer for the weekend, and I'll come back and sort it out later. And again, this was a project I picked at random. It happened again 3 years ago in 2016. Doug walked away from the project. It happened again in 2014 when the original author of Express, TJ, took the slightly unusual approach of selling Express to a third-party vendor, which a lot of people were not terribly happy about, but I can kind of understand where he's coming from. He felt undervalued. He wanted to get rid of this project, and someone was going to give him some money for it. To be honest, I'm less disappointed that he sold the project. I'm more disappointed that he just didn't get much money for it, because honestly, it's worth more than just half a month's pay. That's the sad thing. And I'll finish with a quote I read, that it's not fun anymore. You get literally nothing for maintaining a popular package. And this is an increasing problem within open source at the moment. So, what are the solutions to these problems? There must be a solution out there. We've actually heard a little bit about one of these solutions earlier. Money. Obviously, money is the answer to a great many things. You can solve a lot of things by throwing money at it. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about funding open source. And that's definitely something we should be considering. However, I thought, OK, let's have a look at Express. Let's see if there's anything within Express that's funded. Nothing was funded. So I looked at the software supply chain, the full 195 dependencies, and I found out of those projects there was one that was funded, and it's called ESLint. It's a linting tool. It's a tool that helps enforce certain coding conventions, and it's a really good project. ESLint is supported by Open Collective. You've probably heard of Open Collective. Tidelift is another popular organization that helps fund open source projects. So there's this one project within all of Express that has some support. So I turned my attention to Open Collective. I thought, OK, how much of a difference are they actually making at the moment? So I looked at the top 30 projects within Open Collective to see how much funds they were collecting. Here you can see we've got, I don't know how easy you can see it from the back, but this is a log scale I converted it from dollars into FTE equivalents. So using a standard developer salary, how many full-time developers would it fund? ESLint has enough money coming in to fund 1 and a bit developers. It's actually in the top I think it was in the top 3 at the time. Only 6 of the projects on Open Collective at the time that I acquired this data have enough to fund 1 or more full-time equivalents. As soon as you get out of the top 30, there's enough money to fund 0.01 full-time equivalent. So outside of the top 30, there's enough money for coffee, basically. Now, I really don't want to be come across as being super critical about Open Collective. I think it's a fantastic project, but taking a step back, there's a vast mismatch going on here. Open UK published the State of Open report in 2021. The GDP contribution of open source, they estimate to be 43 billion. Open Collective had a bumper year in 2021 and raised $12 million. So the amount that they are raising each year is increasing considerably, but there's this massive gap going on. Tidelift, they have a VC funding, and I think recently they had another 27 million. Again, these sound like big numbers, but they feel like a tiny droplet compared to the overall worth and value of open source. But also, I genuinely think that money is an important part of the solution. But I think one thing that I want to make crystal clear is that it's not the only solution, and it's not the only way that we're going to solve the sustainability challenges in open source. And to tell you a little bit more about the other part of the solution, I just want to reference this fantastic book by Nadia Egbal, which is called Working in Public. She interviewed a significant number of maintainers, a number of people within the open source community to find out a little bit more about how it actually works, to find out about the motives of the individuals involved. And one of the interesting things is GitHub, whilst being a fantastic platform that has made it a lot easier for people to work in open source, it has also resulted in a slightly strange dynamic where a lot of people have a very transitive and fleeting relationship with open source projects. When I first started out in open source, people tended to stick to a particular project and have a tight-knit community. Now people tend to move all over the place, and the community is really quite fluid. You'll have heard earlier from an economic perspective that some people consider open source to be public goods. I don't think it is. The definition of public goods is it's non-rivalrous, and there's a general consideration that there is zero cost to the replication of software, which is absolutely true. It's a digital good. You can copy it, and it doesn't cost money. It's non-rivalrous. However, that's not the case. Consumption does come at a cost. When overconsumption occurs, the finite resource that we are fighting over is the maintainer's time. And one of the most important take-home messages I found from this book is attention is the most prized asset of maintainers. And attention isn't something you can necessarily buy with money. So just to make that clear, a lot of open source maintainers create software for the love of it and for the joy of it. And if they get bombarded with angry demands to fix security issues, that takes away the time that they want to spend on what they love. And again, this is why there is a rivalrous element to open source. And a fantastic demonstration of how that can go horribly wrong is DigitalOcean's Hacktoberfest. Now, they've run this competition a number of years running, and it sounds like a good idea. And at first, I thought it was a good idea. They give away T-shirts to people who make successful contributions to open source. And on the surface, that genuinely sounds like a great idea. However, what happened this year is that there was a significant number of very low-quality contributions, people basically putting in junk pull requests in the hope of getting T-shirts. The impact this had on the community was significant, and one of the maintainers basically said that it was a corporate-sponsored denial-of-service attack on open source, which is a pretty extreme way of sort of describing the attack on their attention, to use Nadia's language. At this point, I want to follow a completely separate path for a while, and bear with me, the two paths will converge in the very near future. So last year, I worked with some of my colleagues and in close collaboration with Linux Foundation Research to create a relatively comprehensive picture of open source across Europe. We undertook a survey. We surveyed around about 1,500 people, interviewed a large number of individuals across various different sectors, various different countries, to see what we could find about open source across Europe. And we published a report that looks at consumption, contribution creation, all sorts of things. I'd love to tell you more about the report. I could waffle on about it for hours, but I don't have time to. I'm just going to pull out a very narrow thread that emerged within this report. And that thread relates to public sector. In almost every question we asked, public sector was an outlier. And unfortunately, it didn't tend to be an outlier in a terribly good fashion. More often than not, you'd look at the data, oh, public sector, there's something weird going on there. So I want to pull on that thread a little bit. But before I do, I think within the UK, we generally consider the public sector to be quite pro-open source. And this is a pattern that we see across Europe. So the Open Source Observatory published this fantastic report quite recently where they took a systematic approach to look at the legal and the sort of political legislation around open source, and they created this fantastic catalogue. You can see virtually, I mean, you can't really read the writing here, you can probably just about make out the numbers, but virtually every country within the EU and the UK has legal or political policies around various aspects of open source, whether it's adoption, whether it's consumption. The policies are really quite clear. Governments are keen on open source. And our survey echoed exactly the same sentiment. So we asked, to what extent is open source important to your sector? And those within the public sector said, yes, we strongly agree, open source is important to our sector. Those in finance and telecoms were a bit more, it's important-ish. That's great. However, when we started to look at the detail and what was happening on a more day-to-day basis, things were not quite so good. So we asked people a question about the contribution policy within their organisation. So moving from left to right, you're looking at contribution is encouraged, so quite permissive. Permitted, so not quite so open and encouraged, but yes, you can do it. No clear policy, don't know, or prohibited. You'll notice I've highlighted public sector. Only 29% of individuals within public sector felt that they were encouraged to contribute to open source. The thing that I find quite sad is that, I can't quite make out the number now, I think 58% reported that there was no clear policy. That seems like a really bizarre contrast to the fact that you can read a great many EU policies around open source. However, when it comes to the engineers on the ground, it's not something that they can relate to in their day-to-day life. Another thing we asked them is about factors that limit their involvement in open source. So I've just picked out a couple of the most highly reported factors that people feel are limiting. So a lack of policy or a lack of understanding. And this time what we did was we divided the data set into two halves. One half is where the individual reported that their organisation has an open source program office or some form of leadership, and those without. What we found is that in the presence of an open source program office or leadership, far fewer people reported a lack of policy as a limiting factor. So what this shows you is with OSPOs or leaderships, the limiting factors are significantly reduced. So this begs the question, people within public sector, do they have OSPOs or leadership? I think you can probably guess. No, they don't. So we asked about open source enablers, and if we look across the different sectors, only 12% within public sector are aware of an open source program office within the area that they work. 12% visible leadership. These are really quite low with respect to other sectors. Also, interestingly, members of open source organisations. If you look at Linux Foundation membership list, it's primarily private companies. There's very little representation of public sector organisations, and that was echoed in our survey findings. The final thing we asked was, taking a step back, where do people feel we should see more investment in open source? And the overwhelming majority of respondents, whether they worked in public sector or not, said that they wish to see a greater government involvement and consumption of open source. And I think Frederick says it quite neatly here, public money, public code. There's a general feeling that the government should be investing more in open source. So far I've presented two distinct problems, some significant sustainability challenges in open source, and my general belief that we've got some challenges there that we have to better understand the maintainers and the community in order to be able to solve them. And then the other problem, there's a general desire to leverage open source in public sector, but that isn't actually translating into actionable policies. So how do we turn these two sort of problems into a solution? How do we make 2 and 2 = 5? Now, I'm not going to claim to have all of the answers. I'm starting to see what I think is a kind of a glimmer of hope. Now, for me, there's a fundamentally different dynamic when you remove the need for organisations to compete with each other. And within public sector, that is the case. Public sector bodies are not in competition, and that does create a different dynamic. We lean on that dynamic and we rely on that dynamic. We expect our governments to protect public and common goods. We expect them to protect the environment and common land. Yes, we expect private enterprise to do that also, but we understand that the government has a far greater obligation. We should also be leaning on the government to protect open source. However, at the moment, that feels like an entirely unrealistic goal. We have the policy, but it's not translating into something that's actionable on the ground. So I think there are probably a lot of things that need to be done, but to me, there are two that are the most high priority. The first is public sector really does have to become a part of the community. And how they do it, there are various different routes they could take. They could join the community, build the community, find the community. And by this I mean some of the communities that we already have may not be right for public sector. Another thing that we asked within our survey is, what are your main motivations for participating in open source? The vast majority of respondents said it was for interoperability and innovation, those that were in private sector. And this is a common theme. If you're in the private sector, generally you're joining these organisations to improve interop, to open up your platform to a greater customer base or to access innovation. Public sector wants something quite different. They want transparency and cost reduction. So it may be a case that they need a different community. They may need to build their own community that serves their more specific needs. But above all, I think public sector is very much crying out for some form of leadership. It's very much lacking at the moment, and I think that's probably the biggest obstacle to actually achieving the goals that they're setting out in their policies. So they certainly need more open source leaders and open source program offices. Now, at the moment, recent news, Google has laid off quite a lot of their open source leaders. I think that's an opportunity. I mean, to be fair, these two things are not going to happen overnight, and they're not going to solve everything, but I do honestly think they are a great step in the right direction. So can the public sector solve the open source sustainability challenges? That's a question that I think, I'll be asking myself, in the next months and years. It's not an obvious success, but personally, I think it's one of the best bets we have. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Colin.
Colin. I'll get it round the right way. Questions? We have some lady over the far side had a hand up first, just, then followed by the gentleman at the end of the row.
I want to see if I've got a picture of my dog yet.
Hi, Colin. Thank you for the talk. I'm Malvika Sharan, and I'm very interested in this topic, mostly because I lead a few communities in open science which are trying to engage with different sectors.
Yep.
And we've actually met few public sector personnel, and as you said, there's a strong desire and intention to engage.
Yes.
But time seems to be lacking from the public sector sides, as you said, that a lot of people probably are working in their own time or interest. How do we as a community actually try to bridge that gap? Because in one of the slides you said join a community, and I think that's the right thing to do. There are so many communities out there. To bridge the gap, it's actually useful to engage with the existing community rather than building another silo. So yeah, I would love to hear what do you think would be the right approach from our community sides to engage with public sector?
That's tricky. I think one of the things that I think people within public sector need to be educated to a certain extent, and I don't mean educated in a patronising fashion. Another thing that I think is somewhat related is within the UK there has been a general tendency to outsource quite a lot of software to third parties, which I think is a good thing to do, but outsource the creation of it, but don't outsource the expertise. And I think there's been a tendency to accidentally outsource too much, outsource the expertise. And as a result, you lose the understanding of the significance of open source. So again, it's a difficult one to really answer, but to me, it always comes back to education, because and that's why I did my own research at the beginning about Express.js. Until you actually roll up your sleeves and start looking at the detail, it's very hard to gain an understanding of just how fragile the open source infrastructure is. And again, I'd reiterate that handing that problem to someone else isn't the way to solve it. Again, I think a lot of these organizations, OpenSSF, Open Collective, I think they do a fantastic job, but we shouldn't just look at them and go, okay, they've got it sorted out. OpenSSF has sorted out security. Open Collective has sorted out funding. They're fantastic organizations, but we also have to take responsibility ourselves. And that means understanding the code we're using, understanding where it comes from, understanding the dynamic. Quite often in my day job, when people start, we'll use this particular component because it's free, I do say to people, yeah, it's free, great. Just spend a bit of time finding out a little bit more about the community behind that, because it's our responsibility to understand the code that we're using. So again, education, but that's a long, waffly, slightly roundabout answer.
Thanks, Colin. My name's Kaelin. I have two questions. The first is quite specific about your analysis of ESLint, and the second is more open about funding. So the first one, you showed your analysis on the log scale, and you said that the funding that comes through ESLint is enough to pay a developer's salary.
Yep.
I was wondering what time period was that?
Okay,
was that an annual salary?
That particular analysis I did in 2020. I think I took a relatively generous FTE salary that was San Francisco in dollars. So I'm from Newcastle in the UK. It could have probably got 6 full-time engineers there. But considering I perceive the quality of a lot of this software to be your kind of San Francisco quality, I used that as a particular metric. Again, It's a crude way of presenting it, but I didn't want to just put it in terms of money. I wanted to express it in terms of effort. So yeah, it was the equivalent to how much would it cost to have an experienced engineer living in a relatively expensive location.
Thank you. And the second question is, are there any models or examples of public sector funding models that you think are quite inspiring for this conversation?
I'm not aware of any public sector funding models. I know that there are some, I've forgotten, there's one in Germany that is...
Sovereign tech funds.
Yeah, exactly. So Sovereign Tech Fund, and they are doing something similar to OpenSSF in that they've identified some critical software projects that they are supporting, I believe financially and possibly with effort as well. And again, I don't want to knock that sort of thing. That really helps in some areas, but it's not the complete solution. We can't rely on Sovereign Tech Fund, OpenSSF, and Open Collective. We need to take on some of that responsibility ourselves. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi Colin, my name is Rene. You said that public sector is missing leadership. What level of government is that leadership lacking? Is it at the cabinet level? Is it individual agency level? Or is it GDS level? Like where do you think would be more impactful, that leadership to come from?
I think it has... The problem is we've got policy and intention. It's not being translated into something that the people doing the work can understand. So I'm less concerned about where it sits within the government organisation. It has to be something on an engineering level that converts the intention into something practical and useful. I work quite a lot in financial services, and there are lots of significant obstacles around using open source due to regulations and compliance. However, there are ways through it, and you need the technical expertise to create the path that others can follow. So, and again, it's, typically it does have to be at a relatively senior level because you are going to have to exert quite a bit of influence. So sometimes the decisions that you need to make can be quite uncomfortable. Again, when it comes to contributing, you have to describe, most projects are under pressure to deliver. To be able to contribute, you need a bit of slack in your delivery, which again is something that's incredibly hard to negotiate. But yeah, regardless of where it sits, it has to be a role that can convert intention into something that's consumable by the people that are actually writing the code or managing the projects.
Second part as well. Are there any? I think you listed a list of countries where I think they got this right, and where UK was right at the bottom. Is there any country you think we can mostly learn from, copy a model from them?
Not that I'm aware of. No. I mean, again, most of our insights across Europe came from surveys, which were people's experience on the ground. I'd point to the European Observatory if you want to come in at the policy level. So we came in at the practitioner level, and we can see a correlation between the two. We have not done the policy level analysis.
Okay, hi. So I'm Laura Cole, and I'm actually from the UK government. I'm part of the civil service in the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sports. And so I have a couple of points. One slightly bit of a plug, because we are kind of looking at this sort of stuff at the moment, but also a much broader question. So we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment on software resilience, and open source is, of course, a massive part of that, part of why I'm here. I'm here to learn about what we should be doing. So we have a call for views that is open, where we particularly want to hear from people such as, everyone in this room about how we should be doing this. So please do look at that and perhaps come along to a workshop we're doing tomorrow. But a question for you as well is thinking about, a big challenge for us is, how open source communities work is so different to how government works, and we want to sort of, improve how we work together. So I guess my question is, how do you think we should do that? How should we as government officials learn more about how you work, kind of, speak more in your language? Do you have any thoughts on how we can do that?
I think the best place to start is look at the code that you're using, because there isn't... It's getting back to... where is it? the book that Nadia published. Oh, it's not on there. Okay, that Nadia published. She came up with 4 different models for open source. That 4 different common mechanisms that people use to organize themselves. I forget all of them. One of them was the stadium model, where you have a very small number of maintainers and a huge number of intermittent contributors. One of them was a sort of club model, where you have a close-knit collection of people who genuinely know each other effectively as friends. There are various different models. I'd suggest look at the software that you're relying on and directly learn about that, rather than learning about it on a theoretical basis. Because again, you really do need to start learning more about the open source that you rely upon. Because my general feeling is, I work as a consultant, and we ship code to our clients, which are then their end users use it. Now, if there's a problem in our supply chain, if Express gets attacked, and a client machine gets compromised, we can't say, oh, it's not us, it was someone else. Everything that you ship becomes your code. So I think the first starting point is always to learn more about what you are actually shipping and what you are relying upon. And that will get you into the community. So you'll start asking that question. You'll start looking through your bill of materials and start asking yourself, okay, who wrote that? If we have an issue with that, who do we talk to? If we want to enhance that or extend that, how do we do that? And start working through on a practical basis rather than a sort of theoretical basis. That would be my advice.
We've got time for one more.
One more then.
Okay. I'm James. I'm from the Met Office. So I was just wondering, what kind of practical actions should people, particularly technical people within public sector organisations, be taking? So what form of contribution is the most beneficial? Is it sort of financial? Is it putting aside some time to actually contribute on a regular basis?
Yeah, considering there is such a gap between where public sector is and where it should be, I'm going to go in really, really modest, incredibly modest. A habit that I see more and more often, well, I see quite often, is people are slightly afraid of engaging. I quite often, even engineers in our own company, where I try to instill an open source mindset, I'll find someone who may be stuck for a whole afternoon, can't make something work the way they want to, or there's a bug that they're fighting against. And I'll say, why haven't you raised an issue? Why haven't you sort of tried to engage with the community? And I think that would be my one recommendation. Just instill in everyone that it's okay to raise an issue. It's okay to actually... and again, raising an issue makes it almost sound confrontational. I'd say start having conversations with the community, because once you start feeling more comfortable that the open source community isn't something over there, once you start building bridges from where you are to where they are, you will eventually become part of the same community. And again, that's all very hand-wavy, but that will start to solve some of these problems. Cool.
Great. Thank you, Colin. I get it right this time.